Asha Kambon. But it gives me great pleasure now to welcome once again to the Shabaka Kambon, Reverend Kwame Kamau, and Dr. Fergus. Gentlemen and lady, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, my brother Ruskin. Good evening. And good evening to the listeners worldwide and locally.
Absolutely, absolutely. A very pleasant good evening to one and all. Greetings, Baba, our local historian extraordinaire, the historian of the people, the scholar of the people. Welcome to our YouTube audience listening in, our Facebook audience tuned in as well. You know the rules by now. You need to smash like or love the heart button on that live stream. You need to comment. You need to let us know where you're tuning in from. I have an African audience. I have a South American audience. There's a North American audience. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And certainly we want you to share this live as far and as wide as possible. Let your family, let your friends know that Indaba is live. Of course, welcome to Indaba, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, the voice of the people, the place to find consensus. Literally, it is a circle, the place where we come to gather for knowledge to grow. Of course, with me we have already, by way of the live, Dr. Claudius Fergus, and just in time, I was wondering, where was our local activist extraordinaire, man of the people, man that wears many hats. One of these good days, we're going to have to interview to let the audience, especially the new audience, know the very many talents that you bring to the table. But on tonight, we have, of course, as well, Khadijah, our Queen sister from the Emancipation Support Committee. And she's going to be talking to us about all the latest and greatest happening. Many people think that the Emancipation Support Committee is all about our headline, which is the Emancipation Day celebration and, of course, Emancipation Village. But all throughout the year, we do a number of activities. And to bring us up to speed in terms of the latest where that is concerned, we have, of course, Queen Sister Khadijah joining us to deal with that issue. Also talking about the fashion show coming up as well, for those fashionistas that love to, be trending in their African attire, looking all snazzy. She's going to let us know how we can participate, how we can purchase tickets, where we can purchase tickets, what's the theme for this year, and so much more. But without further ado, I want to hand it over to my colleagues, my co-hosts. A very pleasant good night. Oh, there she is. I was just about to hand over to them, but rather hand over to them, I'll come straight to you. Greetings, Queen Sister. Welcome to Indaba. You're no stranger to our audience. What's happening by way of ESC? Tell us what's going on in your neck of the woods.
It's a good evening, Reverend Kamau. Good evening, Dr. Fergus. Good evening, Shabaka. And good evening to our audiences, wherever they are streaming us from. So what's on our calendar right now? We're in the month of May, and we have dubbed May African Liberation Month, saying that we celebrate African Liberation Day on May the 25th. And we also launch, every year, we launch a Pan-African Festival commemorating emancipation on May the 25th, which is African Liberation Day. So for this month, we are focusing on the regional spoken word competition. And we had orientation session with Sister Abby Jackson, and it was fabulous. Abby in her element, she brought herself down to children's level, and they were just scooping and just sponging everything that she was saying. And I can't wait for the competition to see, they applying what they learned from her for their different pieces. So we give them a manual this year. We have 2 speeches, we have 2 calypsos, we have stories as well as poems. But what I want to focus on this evening is our fashion extravaganza, our fashion show, our must-attend fashion show. People look forward to this every single year. And this year, we have a very lovely surprise for persons. So I will tell everyone, come on down, take that Carl Airline and come on down. The door prize this year is 1 return ticket to any Carl destination of your choice.
Wow.
So any Carl destination, and you can win this just by purchasing a general ticket for $300 or a special reserve ticket for $350. I mean, that is when you wait. Okay, 300 is any car ticket to any destination of your choice.
Is that
It's
are
that
homes of
simple.
Indaba eligible? Uh,
No, we are not. Friends and families of Emancipation Support Committee are not eligible for that ticket.
we are keeping it free and we are keeping it fair, so we are not
Yes,
eligible. That CAL destination of our choice is not something that we are eligible to benefit from. But tell us, where are we going to be by way of the fashion show this year? How can they get tickets? Because you've just piqued the interest of everyone. Perhaps there are some persons in the diaspora who want to leave where they are and come and participate. So
yes,
tell us more
and they
about it.
can do that. They can do that because now Carl is now one of our sponsors. So now Carl is that airline of the Pan African Festival. So no matter where you are, look for a Carl flight and come home for emancipation. If it's anything you have to come home for, come home for emancipation. You have enough time. You go from May the 25th until August the 2nd. You can come home on Carl, right? So you can get tickets at Emancipation House. That's 5B Birch Rock Road in Maraval. A landmark is Marcy Stores and Superfarm. You can also get tickets at Queen's Hall box office, as well as Queen's Hall website, as well as the different designers.
Wonderful. I have one question for you. When you tease people about a fashion show, especially an African fashion show, you need to bring the visuals. Do you have some visuals to tease our audience with tonight so that they can get a little feel of what's coming? You
We
call it not just a fashion show, but an extravaganza.
yes, because Reverend Kamau is a fashion show like no other. And we have Richard Young as our
Mhm.
creative director. Richard is going to transform the Queen's Hall Auditorium like no other. I mean, we were in the Garden Theatre for 2 years, and
Mm.
each year he kept stepping it up. So even we at ESC right now, we want to see Richard, what are you going to do? And he keep knocking to the ballpark, even Queen. So it's like they want to see what we are bringing, what we're going to do next. How can we transform this space? And every year we keep, stepping it up, and people are just, wow, this is not a fashion show. This is beyond a fashion show. It's an experience. And you get to come out and see the wonderful designers, their pieces. You don't get to dress up in your way, and you feel proud, to wear your African clothing amongst your brothers and sisters.
Oh, noted, noted. We want to thank you for coming out on tonight and for sharing the information as passionately as you have. I'm sure there are a couple persons just salivating and they want to join. But we move straight over to Baba Fergus, who's going to introduce our Africa report for tonight. Over to you, Baba Fergus.
Yes, indeed. And welcome, my brother Shabaka. Nice to see you.
Greetings, Doctor.
Yeah, well, this one is being a tough one. It seems to be getting tougher every week instead of easier. I'm playing around with the technology, and I still have this ongoing problem with the virus. So I have to do a secondary kind of recording of the videos. I have the videos there, I can't download them, so I have to re-record the videos and then transfer them. So it takes a lot out of me. A lot. So I hope you're satisfied with it. Because, yeah, but I have to apologize to Rennie as well for the very, very late delivery. I almost gave up on this one because it was so challenging getting this stuff put together. But I hope you appreciate it. It's a little bit different from the title that has been advertised. When the title was advertised, it was what I had hoped to address solely, but there's been some late developments with respect to the search for new sites and the reaction of Africans towards Americans, sometimes demanding and pressuring these governments, to surrender to American pressure, French pressure as well, for new bases outside of the Sahel, particularly bases that can accommodate a sort of a naval base as well, not just a land base. So it's a big concern for a lot of Africans. You know, Africans on the ground have been putting pressure on their governments, the grassroots, because, you know, you can't trust some of these leaders in terms of conceding, you know. So a lot of pressure is there, but there seems to be right now a build-up towards rejection of American demands. But we know the French are on the side, and so we can expect anything. But right now, that's the situation. We can't call it a stalemate. The masses are victorious, and the government of Nigeria in particular has had to issue a statement saying that there's no agreement and so on. So let's hear the report and let me hear what you think about that.
Absolutely.
Yes, Renee, bring it up.
Foreign military bases is even a continental problem that has been addressed or has been tried to be addressed by the African Union as far back as 2016. The African Union Security Council passed a resolution where they expressed concern about the proliferation of foreign military bases in Africa. But unfortunately, the African Union cannot order countries not to accept these bases.
The geopolitical equation of American militarism in Niger and all West Africa has changed dramatically over the past 2 weeks. The previous Africa report on Niger highlighted the expulsion of all the French troops and closure of the embassy by the end of 2023. The United States of America reacting by sending some top military and diplomatic officials to negotiate with Niger's military junta, hoping to avoid the same fate. Before continuing with the current analysis, I will provide a brief background of American imperialism in Africa. Many people think this is a new phenomenon. That is far from the truth. Americans are often overlooked in the narrative of early capitalist exploitation within Africa. Since the 17th century, Americans had been entering African ports to traffic in captured Africans alongside British slave traders. During the 19th century, American missionaries provided intelligence on Africa to facilitate the scramble and conquest of the continent. America had a seat at the Berlin Scramble Conference in 1884-1885 to secure its commercial interests in Africa. And of course, there are endless examples of America's CIA attacks on African governments since independence. In 2007, America established the United States Africa Command, or AFRICOM, headquartered in Germany, after massive protests in Nigeria had forced President Obasanjo to reverse his consent to set up the command in Nigeria. It is this AFRICOM that spearheaded the attack on Libya in 2011 to depose and assassinate President Muammar Gaddafi. Had the Nigerian deal not been aborted, it would have meant that the attack on Libya would have been directed from Nigeria, a scenario that Nigeria's military chiefs had warned Obasanjo about. The overthrow of Gaddafi triggered a flood of military-grade weapons southward to as far as Nigeria and Cameroon, to arm jihadist movements in the Sahel and Savannah zones of West Africa, including Boko Haram and other jihadist groups in northern Nigeria. In 2013, the U.S., along with the French, stationed their first troops in the main airport in Niamey, the capital city of Niger. The arrangement was based on a 10-year renewable contract. The following year, the two imperialist countries collaborated to establish the G5 Sahel Security Alliance with 5 Sahelian states, namely Mauritania, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. 2 years later, in 2016, the U.S. began to build a $100 million drone base near the city of Agadez, 750 kilometers from Niamey. It is said to be the largest of its kind in the world. These foreign military bases compromise the sovereignty of their host countries, whereby African governments are not allowed to inspect military assets brought into the country for use in these bases. No declaration is made about them by the importers. Do they have chemical weapons or even nuclear weapons? Only the foreign commanders and their embassies know. One must therefore ask the question, why this military focus on the Sahel? First, let's dispel any notion that these foreign forces are there to help Africans. That's the propaganda that imperialist mainstream media hype repeatedly, that these forces are there to end jihadist insurgencies against the host governments. In ancient times, this Savannah Sahel zone was the world's leading supplier of gold. The situation has changed little. Add to this modern resources of petroleum, natural gas, uranium, lithium, among other minerals critical to the fifth industrial revolution, particularly artificial intelligence, space technology, and green energy. The interest of European powers in this landmass is not the welfare of Africans, but the maintenance of their own security and dominance in world affairs. Mali was the first to abandon the G5 Sahel in 2022. By the end of 2023, all 5 countries had abandoned the arrangement. In October last year, America decided to cut hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to Niger. The objective was clearly to bring military president General Chiani Abdourahmane to his knees to beg for the return of France to Niger. Instead of capitulating to imperialist pressure, Niger teamed up with Mali and Burkina Faso to form a new military and economic alliance and became even more determined to put an end to the NATO conspiracy to keep Africa under the control of Franco-American militarism. With the expiration of the lease due in 2024, Niger refused to discuss renewal with top-ranking U.S. diplomats and military officials, and demanded the withdrawal of American forces, while forging a new military partnership with Russia. The Americans have left Niger and Chad, but have no intention of leaving West Africa. They are desperately negotiating for new sites in countries bordering the Gulf of Guinea. These include Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. The exposé on the secret American plan for new bases broke in Nigeria over the last weekend. The outcry originated in the savannah belt of northern Nigeria, but Nigerians everywhere are waking up to the realities of such a situation should it come to pass. They refuse to believe their government's denial that they have already given France and the US the green light for these bases. According to retired General Danjuma Kefi on Arise TV, if such a base is used to strike U.S. enemies in other countries, it could make Nigeria a legitimate target for attacks. Nigerians recall a long history of resisting foreign military bases, going back to 1960, when they protested the establishment of a British base. They argue that American bases are a threat to Nigeria's cherished sovereignty. They know that the Americans seldom shared military intelligence with Niger.
But again, to go back to the example the Niger gave, is that the Americans refuse to share the intelligence they are collecting with them, and that these terrorists will be attacking their soldiers, and they will not receive any warning from the American drones that this is a group of terrorists coming towards their soldiers so that they could take measures to defend themselves.
That was Professor Jibril Ibrahim. The Americans only use the intelligence gathered to serve their own national and military interests.
From the moment you accept a foreign military base, you are no longer non-aligned. You are directly in one camp. Why are we bringing the Americans to fight a war that's not our war, but their own war? But I think there is a much larger issue of concern for some of us, which is that Nigerians are very proud of their sovereignty. Is it now, after 60 years of independence, that we'll now lose some of our sovereignty to a foreign power that's bringing nothing in return?
Retired General Danjuma Kefi also takes a pan-African perspective.
So for me, I'm not an advocate of having any military base in Africa at all. AU should be very firm on this.
In standing up firmly to American pressure, Nigeria could motivate other less economically strong West African states to do the same. Yes. I find it interesting that while all this action is going on, the Secretary of Defense, United States, is an African American. the commander of that, what they call the commander of the sea power of Africa, is an African American general. And these people, they are as imperialist as anybody else. We know what happened during Obama's rule. That was when Libya was destroyed and Muammar Gaddafi was murdered. Yes, so those are some of the scenarios. Of course, yes, Shabaka, you want to say something?
Yeah, one of these. It's not clear to me from the report whether Nigeria has actually rejected these foreign bases or whether they have accepted them. And the report seems to suggest that there may be something going on that the masses are not aware of.
Well, you got the correct picture. That's the exact picture. The government has made a denial, but the people have their doubts because they have seen some documents they claim, and these guys are professionals in international relations and geopolitics. So they have assessed the situation and they said there's no way that the government, could be trusted in this regard. And that's why they have come all out to put pressure on the government. I've just taken a select few voices, but they are ongoing with this thing until they put the government in a position where they cannot say yes to the Americans. And if they have said yes, they cannot sign. That's the idea behind the onslaught, the media onslaught now.
Right. Okay, so that's where we are. It's good to know.
Yes.
Good to know what's happening on the continent.
And it's not only Nigeria, all the governments on the Gulf of Guinea have been approached. President of Ghana has been approached. President of Cote d'Ivoire has been approached. We don't know what they have said. We don't know what the activism is like there. It has started in Nigeria, and that's why I focus on Nigeria. Because Nigeria would be the big catch anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It
Absolutely.
has a big geopolitical situation in the Gulf of Guinea, and their border, the northern border, actually for over 1,000 miles, run alongside Niger. So if they get into Nigeria, they won't be far from their base in Niger.
It's strategic, very, very strategic. One of the things that comes to mind, and it wasn't mentioned here, but it was, I guess, implicit. There are proxy wars taking place in Africa right now between NATO forces and Russia. And whenever we see these proxy wars taking place, for instance, Sudan being one of them, we find that the native people suffer the most. And so while there may be some immediate financial benefit and or geopolitical benefit for perhaps that particular president and those who are close to them, the people always suffer when they come because you can no longer speak to neutrality. One of our persons, before we go on to the next segment, Queen Sister Deborah, a very, very loyal fan, is saying that's a terrible move to allow this because it's not our war. And once you've allowed them in, then your neutrality goes out the window. You cannot claim to be a zone of peace anymore. You've taken a side, and anytime they want to again engage in their proxy wars, there are you, and by extension your people caught in the middle. But very, very excellent Africa report per the usual.
I recall the words of the Honorable Kwame Nkrumah, who said, "We look neither east nor west, but forward."
Well, this is what Professor Ibrahim was saying, that if you are really non-aligned, as Nigeria has been since 1960, independence, they cannot afford to allow the Americans in, just as they had rejected the British. They had rejected French overtures as well. They cannot allow that. And yes, you're right, Kwame. They did refer, in the extended interview to the question of proxy wars, and these things have been going on. And this is part of the fear. It is inferred in the clip that I selected there, or edited rather, because, I have to put little pieces together. It looks flowing, but often it's a bits and pieces that I pull together to make it continuous conversation. Yes, so that's the report for this week. And of course, a lot of updates on some of the editions that we have presented before. We have to look again at the South African elections, which would be due this month, very, very important. So we will be doing an update on that as well in due course within the next 2 weeks. Okay, so we can move on to the next segment.
Shabaka, over to you. Set this up for us. Set the tone.
Well,
A little birdie tells me that you had an exclusive with one of the most
what
powerful activists.
from our running order is that the first item on our list here tonight is to acknowledge the fact that Trinidad and Tobago has just joined Barbados and Jamaica in recognizing Palestine as a state. And I think we have Dr. Asha Kambon to say a few words to us on that issue. So let's welcome our guest. Indaba, the place where knowledge grows, the place to find consensus, the voice of the people, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee. With me today, I have a very, very special guest, the anchor of Breakthrough News, one of the most outspoken and well-respected international journalists right now on the question of Palestine. And today, that's what we're talking about. We are talking about we're giving you the latest updates on what's happening there. Let me start by just introducing the topic. Right now, as we stand, it's nearly 35,000 Palestinians who've been killed over the past nearly 7 months, with 7,000 others missing and believed to be buried under the rubble. Nearly 78,000 have been wounded. And of course, we've seen the images of girls with one arm missing, and it's just horrendous stuff. The United Nations report called the level of casualties in Gaza unprecedented in such a short period of time. The report also said that the world has not seen the level of destruction of housing and infrastructure in Gaza since World War II. In the United States of America, we now have a massive student protest movement on the way. Gaza solidarity encampments at university campuses across the country. And of course, we have seen with horror the mass repression of these movements, mass arrests and police violence. Nearly 2,200 people have been arrested at 43 colleges and universities in recent weeks. And now, at present, we have Israel that has ordered Palestinians to move again, this time from Eastern Rafah, to evacuate Eastern Rafah ahead of their offensive, which has already begun. And we're seeing those images live on Al Jazeera and on social media. So perhaps we could start right there, Rania. As this thing began, the Israeli government took the Al Jazeera news network, one of the largest networks in the world, off air. Is it that they're trying to hide something? Is it that they don't want us to see what's about to take place in Rafah?
Absolutely. They don't want us to see what's about to take place in Rafah. They don't want us to see. I mean, Al Jazeera is like the only network that has the reach of a mainstream network that's showing what's actually happening also inside of Israeli society, which is just completely consumed by genocidal hate. You have Israelis protesting aid getting into Gaza. You have Israeli officials regularly expressing that they don't believe that there are any civilians in Gaza and celebrating the death of children. It's the same reason that you have the US trying to take, ban TikTok in the US. Israel looks horrible from the outside, and the only way to cover up what it's doing and to cover up just how horribly hateful society is to, break the cameras and to take them offline. And so that's what you see happening here. You see an attempt to try to shut down coverage of an unfolding genocide, but it's too late. We've been watching it unfold for the last 7 months, and we're going to keep watching it unfold because there are Palestinians inside Gaza who have been showing us what they're seeing and what's happening on the inside. But yeah, I mean, it's so ironic because this is the country that the US says is the only democracy in the Middle East. Meanwhile, it's shutting down an entire media network because it doesn't like what the network is saying.
Yeah, and of course, the analysts who have been looking at, who've been trying to sort of make sense of this ongoing genocidal campaign by Israel, point to the fact that this is a settler colonial state. and that this is the natural logic of settler colonialism. What's your view on that?
I mean, I would agree with that. It is the natural logic of a settler colonial state. What Israel's carrying out is it's a perfect representation of everything that Zionism is about, which is, stealing as much land as possible and getting rid of the indigenous inhabitants on it, and replacing them with, in the case of Israel, replacing them with Jews. That's what it's about. That's what the situation in Gaza, that the genocide in Gaza is all about, getting rid of as many Palestinians as possible and trying to reconquer Gaza and trying to resettle Gaza. I mean, that's why you see these people wearing these t-shirts that say make Gaza Jewish again. This is revenge for the fact that Palestinians pushed out Israeli settlers from Gaza, 2 decades ago, and they want it back. It's also just the inevitable outcome of a state that's built on ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's going to keep doing that until it's stopped. And so, I mean, Gaza also in particular, Gaza was marked for death a long time ago. It was put under siege back in 2005. It was put on what Israeli officials called a diet, where they would allow just enough food into the strip so that Palestinians could have a certain amount of calories to just keep living, to keep getting by, to not starve to death. It's been subjected to repeated military campaigns that have been, each one is more devastating than the last, really. And so what we're seeing take place now is also coming from a society that's just become totally fascist. So they're just completely eliminationist in not just their rhetoric, but in what they're carrying out. And the U.S. is there to make sure they can keep going as long as the world allows it. It's just it's horrifying to witness. I just don't even have any words left to describe what Israel's doing in Gaza. Genocide really doesn't seem to cut it.
And I think the world shares your sentiment, that pain and that horror that you experience. And of course, you've been closer to the conflict than most. You've been able to get as close as Lebanon, I understand. But one of the things that has brought joy or hearkened, warmed the spirit across the global South has been the response of students, the brightest and best of the American society, coming out to protest this genocidal campaign. And of course, we've already said that they've been met with, extreme repression. And of course, that in itself has horrified people across the South. The global South is shocked to see the country that has promoted protest all across the world and respect for free speech and so on, treating with their best and brightest in such a manner. You've been there in those encampments. Can you tell us what keeps those students going in the face of violence from the police, from the right-wing fascists, the pro-Zionists and so on? What keeps them going?
Well, I visited a few encampments like you mentioned, and these are young people who are extremely traumatized by the last 7 months. They have watched on their social media feeds children's bodies be torn apart. They've watched Israeli soldiers celebrating tearing those bodies apart. They've watched the U.S. government officials lie about Palestinians, accusing them of committing atrocities they didn't commit, to justify atrocities that, it doesn't even matter if everything Israel said happened on October 7th happened. It doesn't matter. The violence that they've unleashed on Palestinians in Gaza is unjustifiable. Nothing justifies killing over 15,000 babies. Nothing justifies destroying hospitals and burying.
On that scale, nothing justifies terrorism.
Nothing justifies it. And so, this is also the culmination of a decade, I would say, of organizing on college campuses for divestment resolutions, because these are students who pay a lot of money in tuition to go to these colleges. And then they have no say over what their money gets invested in. And they're very upset because they're watching a genocide happen and their money is invested in genocide. So they've been calling for divestment even before all of this happened.
But what we're saying, Rania, is that these students now, because they're going against the grain, their future academics opportunities are compromised, their future job prospects are compromised, and because of the way laws have been being changed and adjusted to make it more difficult to protest, they're facing more stringent situations at the courts. What do you think? You know, you've been there with them, you've seen them, you've talked to them. What are they telling you about why they are willing to risk it to such an extent to stand for this cause?
Because they think it's, you know, risking maybe like a future job prospect, or, you know, your education, or all the things they are risking, which are very real.
A higher moral stand.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's nothing compared to what Palestinians are facing in Gaza. And look, a lot of these students, not all of them, but a lot of them are Palestinians themselves. They've lost, you know, dozens to hundreds of family members. They're watching their families starve. They're hearing phone calls of desperation, of just the worst horrors imaginable. So in their minds, it's like the least I can do is comfortably sit in an encampment and maybe be arrested, or maybe get booted out of school, maybe suspended. It's a risk people are willing to take because the atrocities that are taking place in Gaza are just so much worse. But also, I mean, a lot of these kids, they don't want to live in a world where this is allowed. This is a frightening situation. And also it's become more than just about, I mean, it is about Gaza, it is about Palestine, but they're also recognizing that they don't live in a democracy. They live in a country that is willing to put, you know, military clad police officers on students peacefully protesting. And so now there's a real anger at the authorities, at the state, at the fact that they have no say in what's happening with their money and in their name. And so that's what's driving them.
Yeah, one of the interesting themes coming out of the protest is when we saw police storm and attack students at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, because we remember in 2017 when that university was overrun by neo-Nazis in their khaki pants and their button-up T-shirts chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And we both remember seeing, I remember professors cowering in their offices, afraid to go outside because of the presence of these neo-Nazis. And there was no police there to protect those professors. There were no police there to chase those neo-Nazis. But today, students against genocide, encamped against genocide in a peaceful protest, they're being arrested and beaten. Does it suggest perhaps that there is more anger against there's less anger against those who hate Jews and more anger against anti-war protesters who criticize Zionism? Is there not something strange about that?
Absolutely. And, it goes to the fact that the police represent the class consciousness of the state, right? A bunch of fascist protesters chanting "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil," sadly in America, isn't going against the status quo. It's not challenging power.
Yeah, but when we hear the rhetoric on TV, Biden and others talk about, anti-Semitism, but these guys are the height of anti-Semitism. They are the real anti-Semites, and yet
because they don't really care. They don't really care about anti-Semitism. That's at the end of the day, they're wrapping themselves in this guise of fighting anti-Semitism to shut down protests against Israel. Because at the end of the day, what is Israel? What is Zionism? It's an extension of American imperialism. And that's why the US is willing to protect it at all costs. So when it comes to putting the police on all these protesters, it's also because these protesters are challenging US empire by challenging Israel and its genocide, by challenging war in general, because these students aren't just asking for divestment from Israeli genocide and occupation. They're also demanding that divestment of their student funds from the military industrial complex, from US weapons companies, which, by the way, universities, what business do you have investing student funds in Lockheed Martin? It's completely absurd, but that is the US. So these students are a danger, they're a threat, not just to the, idea of Israel existing as a settler colony, but to the general ongoing imperialism of the United States, because they're not just talking about Gaza. That's, of course, the central issue here. They're also talking about what the U.S. has done in other places in Latin America, all across the Middle East. They don't want a U.S. Cold War with China. There's other conversations being had that scare these administrations, that scare people in power. And I want to add one more thing. This is happening at universities that are Ivy League, places like Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, Columbia. These are the places of higher learning that produce the future leaders of empire. So it's incredibly disturbing for US government officials to see that the students coming out of these propaganda factories are coming out saying no to genocide and no to empire. That's a real threat to the future stability of the people who are going to rule America when they're saying no to imperialism.
That's an interesting insight. Well, let me give you some good news. Here in the Caribbean, in April on the 21st and 23rd, Barbados and Jamaica, recognized Palestine, the state of Palestine, respectively. And on the 2nd of my own country here in Trinidad and Tobago, we also recognize Palestine. And of course, our Prime Minister, the official communique stated that recognition of Palestine is moral and just, demonstrates Trinidad and Tobago's acknowledgement of and support for the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. How does that make you feel, and how is that that kind of action? Is that kind of action genuinely helpful at this time?
Absolutely. I think the more places in the global South express their solidarity with Palestine in the ways that they're able to, the more it shows the divide taking place in the world. The majority of the world does not support what Israel's doing. The majority of the world does not support the ongoing colonization of Palestine. The majority of the world, as you see with the UN votes in the General Assembly, support not just a ceasefire, but support Palestinian liberation. Israel's supporters are America and Germany and a bunch of other European countries that are typically supportive of imperialism. That's it. A very small minority of the world supports this disgusting level of barbarity and violence. So I think it's so important when countries in the global South step forward and recognize Palestine and put their weight behind, it's like a no-brainer. It's either you're with genocide or you're against it.
I think we could leave that there for today, Rani. I'm so happy that you were able to join us here on Indaba. And of course, for the benefit of our listeners here in Trinidad and Tobago, we will be inviting you to join us in the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series this year. I know you haven't received that invitation yet, but I'm giving you
Yes, Shabaka, brilliant interview. It was cut short by a little bit. I don't know why. Somebody did some editing in the back room. Somebody did some editing.
We just put in on notice that we will.
And a notice came up. The Bahamas also recognizes Palestine as of that is the 6th. That was Monday. Okay. Yeah. So you can add that to your portfolio as well. Welcome, my sister, Dr. Asha Kambon. Welcome back, I should say. Of course, by now you're an expert on this topic, so we welcome your views, not just opinion, but your analysis on this situation. Yes, welcome.
Evening,
before we address Dr. Kambon, one issue a question really. Now you talked about 35,000 dead in your introduction. For quite some time, the Trinidad and Tobago government had indicated its recognition for Palestinian statehood. And of course, long before the 7th October of 2023, we know what that date means now. So the question is, why now? Is this a strategic declaration, or is it simply coincidence that these countries in the Caribbean are making this declaration at this point in time? Is this part of the international politics we are into now, or is it simply a matter of that the time is right for the recognition of Palestine? Which is it?
I think that the impression I get is that the leadership of CARICOM at this time is as disturbed as the rest of the global South at what is happening in Palestine, and I think they've been resistant to make any overt gestures around the issue for some time now. But I feel like the activist community, the Emancipation Support Committee, the Caribbean Freedom Project, organizations in Barbados, Jamaica, the trade union movement, Muslim organizations in the country. We've been writing the Prime Minister, we've been writing the Minister of Foreign Affairs, calling for these kinds of moves. We've also been calling for divestment from Israel as the students are in the United States of America. So that activism has given some encouragement to our governments to do what I think they feel is the moral thing to do as well. I don't think they're going against their own sentiments in making these kinds of decisions. I just think that we have added to that environment. They know that within their own countries, the people will applaud these moves, and so that's important. I just want to share one more thing today. I came across the fact that there was another debate in Congress where these Republican senators, now after having dealt with the universities and had heads roll and so on, they've now gone to the colleges and accused the colleges of anti-Semitism and so on. And one of the leaders of one of the colleges today in an exchange, or yesterday, pointed out that in 2017, after the neo-Nazi anti-Semites chanted "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil" in Virginia, Donald Trump, the then president of the United States of America, said there were many good people in that particular congregation. And of course, he was supported by many on his side of the aisle in that particular persuasion. And this particular university, this college director, asked instead of, in the previous incarnations, the university directors have not pushed back on this congressional hearing. But on this occasion, one of the directors of the colleges asked all of them, will any of you all reject or condemn these comments that Trump made at that time, that all these anti-Semites were actually good people? And no one in that congressional hearing was ready to condemn those comments. And it goes back to
Shabaka, we need to bring in Dr. Asha. We need to hear her voice. And I want to take the privilege of inviting our brother Kwame to lead off in the interview.
Doc, just to make the point that this is not about anti-Semitism. Going back to the thing,
Of course, I think we're all on the same page. We're all on the same page.
Embrace the anti-Semites, but they are pro-Zionist.
Absolutely, and the point is underscored, and we absolutely are thankful for your marvelous interview. Now, as I welcome again, to use the word of Dr. Fergus, Baba Fergus, back, the illustrious, effervescent Queen Mother, that is Dr. Asha Kambon. Again, welcome back to the program. My first question to you, Trinidad and Tobago is the 143rd nation in the world to recognize Palestine and its statehood, citing moral and ethical reasons for so doing. Of course, Trinidad has had a history of supporting Palestine. In principle, we see up and down CARICOM by way of Her Excellency Mia Motley out of Barbados, and a number of other statesmen and women, Rav Gonzalez out of the Honorable out of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, also supporting this move. Do you believe that CARICOM is finding its political footing, so to speak, and they while they have been defending and supporting Palestine quietly over the years, do you believe or do you see that we are moving in a new direction where we are being a little more vocal, not only on this issue, but other issues? And what do you think would be the possible implications of those decisions being made by small nation states like Trinidad and Tobago? And again, pleasant good night and welcome.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, colleagues. Nice to see everyone once again, even though I see you all every week. because I listen to Indaba quite religiously. Okay, one of the things is that we have to think that the 3 or 4 countries, Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and Jamaica, these really were the 4 last ones. Many of the other countries, 11 of them since Cuba since 1988, but our English-speaking Caribbean countries, many of them, I think since 2011, some of them began recognizing the state of Palestine. For the state of Palestine to come into being, they need 2/3 of the countries, of all the global countries that are members of the UN. And we have seen very recently the Palestinian ambassador to the UN making his rounds in the Caribbean, in a sense, saying to the other colleagues who had not yet recognized the state of Palestine, well, please do so now, because we are at this moment of crisis where we need the support. And it would be very, what shall I say, it would be out of character and out of tenure for Caribbean countries not to recognize the state of Palestine and not to condemn the state of Israel for its apartheid. Because remember, the Caribbean actually was little Caribbean, small states. They were the driving force against apartheid in South Africa. You know, Randall Robinson, who was living in North America at the time, remember, he's from USVI. So, and he led that campaign to boycott South Africa so that you could have a free Africa, a free South Africa. So it's not out of character, and the expectation of most states is that the Caribbean would stand on that side of social justice, because that's what we have done. That's the principle. We have some principles in the UN that the Caribbean has always stood. So there's the expectation that we would stand on those principles. So, I mean, for us here, it's a deep breath of, some of us were hanging on by our fingernails, saying, and as Shabaka pointed out, saying to our governments, well, listen, you have to act as you have done in the past and stand on that position of principle against an apartheid state and for self-determination. Because for small island developing states who can be overrun by a big state in a minute, the principle of self-determination is critical in international relations. And I remember when, for instance, that's why Chambers did not agree for the invasion of Grenada. He would not agree. And you had when the Brits decided to invade Anguilla, it was Anguilla, was it, in the 60s? And I remember most of the English-speaking Caribbean was definitely against that move. And one of our Calypsonians sang, how could they do that in Anguilla when Rhodesia, what's his name was not Smith.
Ian Smith.
Ian Smith was large and in charge, and the Brits weren't doing it. So we have that sense in the Caribbean of defending self-determination, defending independence, fighting against apartheid, and so on. So that's expected. Now, we've even gone further, which is interesting, because Belize actually broke ties. They suspended diplomatic relations with Israel because of the bombing of Gaza and because of the international humanitarian crisis. And they did that in November of 2023. And in a sense, this is the kind of moral direction we would like to see all of the CARICOM member states take. We would like them to also break diplomatic relations, say that the genocide has gone beyond what is acceptable. As well, there's a lot of expenditure going on, which we know nothing about. And I would hope that this procurement legislation that is driving everyone crazy would actually allow us to see if, in fact, a lot of our own taxpayer dollars is not being spent in the procurement of all kinds of so-called safeties, security equipment and technology and so on, coming right out of Israel. And if that is the case, our government should as well put a pause and halt that, because it's the same kind of divestment that the students are calling for, we may have to call for as well. But right now we don't know, because procurement is still a kind of a shady business for most of us. You can't
Just
see
clear,
who's
we have called for it already.
yeah, it's got to stop. It's got to stop. So that's where it's going in the future, Kwame. So your question is, where is it going, and are we on the right track? Most definitely we are on the right track. Now we have Belize leading the way with breaking diplomatic ties. We have no reason not to. And also we have to start looking at how the money, there used to be a thing that said, follow the money. We have to see where the money is being spent. And if indeed our taxpayer dollars are being spent there, we have to say, we would feel better that you spend it elsewhere.
If I may at all, the follow-up question was the implication.
Just to be clear, we have called for the break of diplomatic ties as well.
Yes.
Just to be clear.
So that's formally on the record. Duly noted, acknowledged. The question of implications, I want you to touch on that issue, because when you are a microstate, and we are, and when there's such heavy dependence on imports and security apparatus within CARICOM coming from the north, it means then, therefore, that there could be some pressures brought to bear, as has happened in times past. And you were referencing Operation Sheepskin in relation to that atrocity that occurred with regards to it in 1969, when Britain did indeed bombard and take over Anguilla in a way that, of course, was unjustifiable. But again, the implications, when small nations stand up against big nations, and there are big allies of those nations as well that you depend on, what can be those implications to these small island states? And more than that, how do we overcome it?
Yeah, good question, Kwame. The truth of the matter is, we have to stand on diplomatic principles, and the UN Charter gives us enough room to be able to stand on those principles. Now we've seen them completely flaunt, and we've seen like international law almost doesn't exist based on what has been transpiring over the last 6 or 8 months. But at the same time, for small island developing states, it's important that we ensure as best as we can that the big states abide by the international framework. Otherwise, we are lost. If there's no international framework, we don't have a leg to stand on. Anything can happen to us. So it is even more imperative that we have diplomats who can speak and constantly remind the larger international community that these are the things that they must abide by. Because the minute these things are swept away, we have no ground to stand on. So we are the ones who have to ensure that nations abide by the international humanitarian laws and abide by the principles of
the international rules-based system.
Hold on, stick a pin. We are at the top of the hour, and we have to say thank you to our audience on 91.1 FM. Thanks for joining us in this week's edition of Indaba. Thank you very much, and we bid you good night. See you again next week. Thank you, Ruskin, and good night as well. So the conversation will continue as we wrap up on the other media. So continue.
Yeah. So the point I was making, just to rewind it a little bit, is that in fact it is to our benefit as small island developing states. And of course, there's always risk. Kwame, you are correct. There's always some risk that you may offend a big state. It's the risk you have to take. It's like what's happening on the continent now. They don't have the same the same impediments that we have in terms of size and so on. But what they have is the impediment of poverty and the impediment of GDPs that don't seem to grow, and the impediment of being consistently exploited and their own rights, their population rights eroded and so on. And yet they still have to challenge. They have to challenge, and that's what we're seeing. They are indeed challenging the superpowers and saying to them, "Listen, we have to have our own self-determination," and that's what has to happen. You know. So yeah,
I have just one question. I have just one question. It's on the topic and also beyond the topic. And the takeoff point is in reference to the 2/3 vote that is required for new nationhood, new states to be recognized. Now, the Caribbean, we know from previous discussions, the Caribbean has about 20-something entities that do not have independence, and therefore they are not recognized as states, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, at the UN level. Now, that effectively deprives the Caribbean of 20-something votes. So that on issues like this, the Caribbean is denied its full voting potential because of their legacy or the retention of colonialism. And now when you add Africa, naturally, because of the Pan-African community that we need to herald, Africa alone has 54 votes. Now when you add 54 plus 23 missing, plus I think 15, 16 CARICOM, plus others like Cuba and so on, we could have a significant voice, much more than we have, in influencing certain directions that the UN can take, or the global community on a whole, particularly in reference to this issue. Could you briefly comment on that? That neo-colonial situation that we are locked into, is this part of the game by the superpowers and others to ensure we do not have a full voice in the United Nations and other international fora?
Absolutely. Great question, Dr. Fergus. I mean, the truth of the matter is Eric Williams and Castro recognized the voice, the lack of voice, and the silencing of those so-called, what used to be called, non-independent states in the Caribbean, colonies. And what they did is they agreed to establish in the ECLAC system, which is one of the secretariats that brings together countries to make decisions before they go before the General Assembly and have voice. It was Eric Williams and Castro that agreed on what was called a Caribbean CDCC, the Caribbean Development Commission, something, I'm trying to remember the exact framework. But the idea was they established a committee in the region through the UN that gave voice to these non-independent countries or colonies. And of course, the thing functioned well for some time, but after a while, as other leaders came into being, and that grand vision of West Indian independence and self-determination and all those things, the nationalism that our early founders had seemed to have, gone down the drain later on. I'm not sure, dissipated, waned. I'm not sure what the language would be, but and therefore a lot of the what were colonies and what were the responsibility of the UN to ensure that those colonies arrived at some sense of self-determination, that it was the job and the responsibility of the UN in the Caribbean. It had that responsibility because of inaction, I would think, by our own heads of states in that regard. That whole it leaves us in the situation you described, where we do not have fully independent states in the region, where the Caribbean region has, I think, the most colonies still, with all sorts of names: overseas territories, Département de France, all sorts of names they're called now. But the bottom line is the UN says the people are not able to exercise their own self-determination, and they are still Um, they still meet. There's a special committee that looks at their. I can't remember which one it is. It might be the fifth committee or something of that sort that continues to look after those the condition of people who live in those circumstances.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a question that arises coming out of the UN and its framework. And it's a brilliant question you asked, Dr. Fergus, so I'm going to build on it. I'm going to stack on it. There are calls, and of course, it's coming from the Caribbean. It's coming from one of our leading voices in Ambassador David Commission, among others. And they are saying that the UN Security Council, those member states that continue to enjoy a veto, that has to go. Because even if everyone else agrees, and even if and when, I don't say if, when we bring on those non-independent territories into the legitimization and the statehood and the sovereignty that they need to enjoy, because the UN as an institution is compromised, you will just have many more voices saying the same thing, with what we would call a vocal minority that have a very powerful a veto that they can exercise, that would allow for those nations really not to have the true voice, the true power, the true sovereignty that is required. Let's speak to the issue of one, the veto and the need for us to remove that veto from those that currently enjoy it and that currently abuse it. We've been seeing it over the years, and what will it take? Because there's been calls for that removal for a long time now. There's been calls for an African state being given a permanent seat on that Security Council for a long time now, but it's been falling on deaf ears. What do you think it takes for us to make a move like that? There are calls for it, but what will move the ball forward? What will take us into critical mass, in your opinion?
That's probably the most challenging thing to happen. If it will happen in our lifetime, I'm not sure. And that is because the structure of the governance structure of the UN is such that as it stands now, they would have, that very Security Council would have to approve the changes. And of course, they're not going to. What is it? Frederick Douglass told us, power does not, give away its power itself. So that is a very, very, very challenging thing. I don't think, though, that we should treat it as a stumbling block to advancing the issues we want to advance. Because if you look at how the Palestinian issue has been treated in that Security Council, I mean, it's most disturbing when only one state put up its hands and says, we veto this. No, we disagree. It's very disturbing and so on. But at the same time, what has happened is that the case of the Palestinians has been heard, and more people are now aware, and more countries are doing what even our own country did. Be it maybe a little late, that some of the last three countries have agreed. They have done it. They have said, listen, the state of Palestine must be recognized. And I think if they didn't have all that exposure, if they didn't have observer status, and if the Palestinian ambassador could not come and plead his case before all nations of the world, we would not have moved to the point where we are all now recognizing that there must be the state of Palestine must be recognized. And I think that's an excellent place for the world to be in.
Shabaka, any questions from you?
No, I mean, I think that, we have to congratulate the government when it does something right. As I said, this is something that a number of groups came together and called for some time ago. We wrote a long letter to the Prime Minister's office. We sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We sent copies to the CARICOM Secretariat. And so, and of course, we're talking about groups here in Trinidad, but the same thing is happening right across the Caribbean. In fact, across the global south, really. I mean, the majority of countries in the world, really, the majority of people in the majority of countries find what is taking place in Israel to be a crime against humanity, and really want to do anything they can at this moment to stop the genocide. It's something that we could not imagine. You know, we come from countries in the Caribbean where that have a history of genocide, and it's something that we always thought was a historic phenomenon, historical phenomenon, not something that we would see again in our own lifetime. So it's you know, it's very, very disturbing, and I don't think there's any decent human being alive who feels that they have some agency, who doesn't feel compelled to do something at this time to make a difference.
Yes, Kwame, your curtains are looking to get pulled at this time as usual. So do the wrap up for us as usual in your brilliant way, and just take a peek at the comments while you do that.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to thank our very special guest on tonight, Dr. Asha Kambon, for joining us and bringing her wealth of experience and expertise to bear on this very, very sensitive topic and issue. Always fearless, always courageous, always daring to push the envelope, and we thank you for it. As we look into the comment section, we see, definitely a very broad cross section of individuals. Again, we want to recognize Queen Sister Deborah out of New York. We want to recognize as well the Kingdom of Judah in America, based actually in Honduras, bringing royal greetings. Dan Mann is out of Jamaica. We salute you, we see you, we recognize you. As a matter of fact, he gave a really sterling comment. He said, as usual, Honorable Fergus, brilliant African report. Thank you. Always interesting, updating Africans in terms of African affairs. And so we thank him for that comment. We see as well Bongo Wisely Tafari greeting us and bringing love. And again, a number of persons out of the Bahamas and elsewhere really joining in to lend their voices. I want to especially welcome from the Bay Area in California, Sister Lawanda Knox, with regards to her participation in tonight's program. We've dealt with a number of issues. We started, of course, with talking about local issues and what's happening with the ESC, the fashion extravaganza that's coming up. We went on to talk about what's happening in terms of Nigeria and the possible role that they can play in terms of perhaps maybe being a place where a military base of the US may be situated, and the implications of that sterling report. And then beyond that, we went into this amazing interview by way of Shabaka Kambon, interviewing one of what we would call progressive TV, progressive media's leading voices, dealing with the whole issue of, one, recognizing Trinidad being the 143rd nation to recognize Palestine as a state, and dealing with the broader issue of again, the student protests and the implications and the impact. Persons really putting their careers on the line, putting really their tenure within the college or the university on the line over this very sensitive issue. It was a marvelous interview, and we are certainly looking forward. The little bit that was clipped tells us that we are going to be hearing from this voice in the lecture series coming up. I'm hoping that absolutely is a thing, so that we can get part 2 of this amazing discussion. Of course, to bring up the rear end, we did have Dr. Asha Kambon speaking to this issue as well, dealing with it from a CARICOM perspective, and dealing with it from the perspective where she's recognizing our Queen Mother, that though some of the things that we do may be dangerous, may be perilous, may have severe implications, we need to do it anyway. We need to do it anyhow. Well, with that said, we are out of time. We are not out of, however, love and faith and words. But this brings, as it were, the curtains down on yet another edition of Indaba, the voice of the people, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, the place to find consensus, I want to thank our activist extraordinaire, and I do mean that. That's not just idle flattery. It's really a brother from another mother in Brother Shabaka Kambon. I do want to thank the people's historian, the people's scholar, my co-host Baba Fergus, because it's one thing to be a scholar, it's another thing to be available to people to unpack the issues and to bring it from that level of scholarship that you deliver each and every time. With that said, we sign off for tonight, thanking our technical staff, Renee Francois, thanking Khadija for dropping by as well, and of course thanking our producer, Queen Mother Zakia Zuma Wadada, for giving us that wonderful direction that she does every episode. But again, we are out of time and we are saying goodbye and good night.
Good night.